army doesn't like more than one disaster in a day.
Looks bad in the newspapers and upset civilians at their breakfast.
I'm Bill Bupert, retired Army officer and irregular warfare practitioner and scholar. Welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an irregular warfare podcast, the show that examines the mythos, lost history, bad thinking, martial malpractice, and government incompetence that informs so much of irregular warfare. Today I want to peek behind the curtain at the vast machinery and briar patch politics of insurgency and counterinsurgency and everything in between. Now, let's go ghost hunting together. Hello, this is Bill, and welcome to episode 86 of Chasing Ghosts, an irregular warfare podcast. The title of this episode will be Hybrid Warfare in the New Age, Stretching the Envelope, Part 1. So with the conclusion of the summer hiatus, let's jump right into it. You know, here we are at episode 86 of this podcast series, and then War Notes has 21 podcast episodes. And during that time, I have hinted at hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare, non-linear warfare. As a matter of fact, Michael Lind would probably appreciate the fact that his permutations of the generations of war, first, second, third, fourth, and fifth, some have supposed that there's a sixth or a seventh. I think that ontologically and epistemologically that's stretching the truth a bit as we speak, so we will confine ourselves to establishing some definitional standards of what we're talking about here. Now, hybrid and non-linear warfare represent two of the most significant developments in conflict and warfare in the 21st century. Their complexity and fluidity characterize these forms of warfare, and the blurring of traditional lines between combatants and civilians and politicians, and between war and peace and the gray zone in between. Hybrid warfare is a type of conflict that blends conventional and unconventional methods, including military operations, cyber warfare, disinformation campaigns, color revolutions, political influence, economic pressure, money laundering, graft. This form of warfare is not limited to a single shape or dimension, and it involves a mix of both regular and irregular tactics across all the dimensions of war. You know, I've spent a lot of time treating irregular warfare in Chasing Ghosts because that, after all, is its portfolio. But the term hybrid warfare has been in use since at least 2005, when it was employed to describe the strategy used by Hezbollah in the 2006 Lebanon War, in which Hezbollah and other forces, Arab forces, fought the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israelis in their own home country to a standstill. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that it was Israel's worst war yet. Israel, in my mind, and I need to devote some episodes to this, and maybe I'll do it in War Notes, hasn't won a conflict since 1967. One can say that 1973 was a draw and stalemate, but everything since that time, I would suggest, is an unmitigated disaster for Israeli arms. Now, the Israelis excel at hybrid warfare. Take the recent pager phenomenon that occurred a couple years ago, in which somehow, some way, brilliantly, cleverly, they were able to infiltrate small amounts of trace explosives in pagers. Hezbollah, Hamas, and others who were opposed to the Israelis just so happened to use pagers on a regular basis throughout their forces and chains of command. And on one day, I think it was over a 48-hour period of time, they managed to make these explode. Most of those were wearing them on their hips, led to considerable killing, considerable damage, considerable injury, and on reflection was a most interesting and innovative way, a hybrid warfare tactic, to take out certain of their enemies. But I would urge all of you to read the Winograd Commission report in 2007 that was issued because of the drubbing that the Israelis took in the 2006 Lebanon War, which was an even more severe drubbing than they got in the 1982 Lebanon War. Non-linear warfare, on the other hand, disrupts the traditional battlefield, making it difficult to distinguish between combatants and civilians, or between times of war and peace. This form of warfare utilizes a grand strategy approach, where force-on-force conflict is not the primary objective. Instead, the goal is to create a complex and fluid situation that exploits an opponent's weakness. Yes, it does hearken to Sun Tzu or his even more brilliant grandson, Sun Pin, and some of the things that they said would contribute to a victory in warfare in which one isn't conventionally prosecuting that war. Now, several factors, including advances in technology, the increasing interconnectedness of the world, and the evolving nature of threats, have driven the use of hybrid and non-linear warfare. These forms of action allow state and non-state actors to gain strategic advantages without resorting to full-scale conventional war. Now, mind you, this isn't new, nor is it more sophisticated than things that have taken place in the past. One can go back thousands of years and find these kind of grand strategic intrigues occurring. Rome was able to best some of its opponents, Egypt for instance, by using these very actions and not simply relying on the force of their legions. You will note that the more interconnectedness, the more connections there are in a world, the more it can become easy to leverage these kind of hybrid and gray zone tactics that are occurring. One can go back recently to 2020 in the fight between Azerbaijan and Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh, where all of a sudden you found Russian-influenced little green men with no distinguishable rank markings nor name tapes coming in and destabilizing certain areas. The use of UAVs and FPVs over the past 6 years since 2020 and accelerating at light speed since 2022 and the Russo-Ukrainian war, that in a lot of cases, one can call this a non-linear battlefield that's taking advantage of that interconnectedness. Now, as you know, when one tries to identify systemic failure, well, what caused that failure? What was the prime reason? What was the auxiliary reason? What was the ancillary reason for that happening? You can create a tree to establish what the root cause is. I'd mentioned the Romans. We can go back to the early 20th century and discover that when you look at what Michael Collins and Eamon de Valera did with the Irish question during Britain's involvement in World War I, they were able to use this kind of political, even color revolution type patina to the revolutions that they were conducting against wresting and eventually securing the English departure from Ireland proper after 800 years. Leto Vorbeck was able to do the same thing in Africa. And of course, we have T.E. Lawrence. And I urge all of you to watch that film. I watch it at least once a year. It's highly recommended. Now, does it take historical and artistic license with what actually happened? It absolutely does. But what it also shows is that in this case, the nonlinear and the linear forces, the nonlinear force being Lawrence, of course, promising an Arab unifying political mechanism to all the warring tribes of the Bedou in the Levant, and through a number of very savvy ways, to include his keen leadership of guerrilla forces, he manages to, I would suggest, use hybrid warfare to defeat the Turks and to a certain extent defeat original British war aims in Arabia proper. Now, many would say that the Russo-Ukrainian War began in 2014 with the color revolution that was installed by the West, where they took a Russian-facing Politico and replaced him with a Western-facing Politico. I would tell you it goes before then. It goes to 2008. If one were to go down this rat hole and determine, well, where did that come from? Well, actually, one would discover that 2008, we can call that the marker. Because at the time, William J. Burns, later the CIA director under Joseph Biden, he titled, because at the time he was the ambassador to Russia, he titled a cable, a fancy word for an internet message, an email, titled Niet means Niet Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. Now, what he said on February 1st, 2008, was that according to all the intelligence and analysis that he had gathered with his team on the ground in Moscow at the time, that the invitation of the Ukraine to NATO or even neutrality was a red line for which Putin and the Russian government would not countenance such a thing and would invade the country to stop it from happening. And this was also a concern because of the constant Ukrainian abuse over half a dozen years of the easternmost oblast provinces in the Ukraine who were Russian-aligned, Russian-speaking, and Russian-sympathetic. And the Kyiv government would go so far as to lob artillery rounds or gather people up and have mass jailings and treat protests in a fashion that most Westerners would blanch at. Again and again, it was the brightest red line. Ukrainian entry into NATO was described as an existential red line for the entire Russian political elite, uniting liberals and hardliners alike. Because for the longest time, as I have mentioned in previous episodes, in 1812 to 1815, the Napoleonic invasion of Russia from France, and then later on, Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1942, after a 2.5-year alliance with the National Socialists, this rather acrimonious divorce would take place, with the largest land invasion the Germans had ever launched along the eastern border of Russia and well into Russia. By the way, Operation Barbarossa was brilliant in the first 30 days, but by the time the end of 1942 came, it was the zombification of the German army, and it took said army 3 years to perish as a result of this giant strategic blunder. One of my favorite publications, the U.S. Army War College Quarterly Parameters, in the 2021 had a very interesting article by Ilmari Kaiko. The Evolution of Hybrid Warfare, Implications for Strategy in the Military Profession. I thought that in this, the author gave a pretty brilliant idea of exactly what hybrid warfare was. Quote, while the hybrid war concept received some initial attention, its breakthrough came in 2014 with the Russian occupation and annexation of the Crimean Peninsula from the Ukraine. Hybrid warfare was immediately linked to a now famous speech by General Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Russia, to the extent that it became used interchangeably with an entirely mythical doctrine named after him. In the September 2014 NATO Wales Summit, hybrid warfare was discussed alongside Russian aggression. These developments caused Hoffman's original concept that already rested on shaky analytical grounds to start evolving to a problematic direction. Hybrid war now became synonymous with Russian rather than non-state actors, and was seen as the most immediate security threat for the West. This evolution turned hybrid war into an ambiguous catch-all concept, which constantly risks reinventing the wheel. While this plasticity makes the buzzword useful in policy and public discussions, the lack of precision hinders its use for scholarly and policy purposes. End of quote. Now, absent a precise definition, hybrid war risks saying both everything and nothing, and we're going to try to put that notion to bed during this podcast episode and the other parts that I suspect will follow here. I chose this article because it was published in 2021, most likely drafted, written, edited, and approved in 2020, a full 2 years before the Russian invasion, so that we could get an idea of what the strategic conceptual framework and reception of the threat was in the West. So he goes on to write something very, very interesting here. And what he writes is evolution of hybrid war to gray zone conflict. Well, he says something that I find provocative. Quote, the second issue with equating hybrid war with Russia is the assumption hybrid war will always be initiated by an aggressive opponent, leaving everyone else on the receiving end. This difference between the perceived need to become better at strategy while reactively shielding ourselves from outside interference is a crucial one. Status quo actors seek to protect and maintain what they have, whereas revisionist actors like Russia actively seek to attain change. The assumption that only our adversaries possess active strategies betrays a limited understanding and practice of strategy and a lack of urgency to master hybrid war, end of quote. Now, I need to emphasize something here for those of you new to my podcast episodes and series. This is something that I think that I've threaded through a lot of my episodes, and that is one can't take a specific tactical, operational, or strategic framework, reference, or TTP, tactics, techniques, and procedures, and think that you can freeze frame that in time, divorce it from all of its antecedents and precedents, and think that for one glorious, bright, shining moment, it just occurred in a vacuum. Nothing in war occurs in a vacuum. Everything has authorship. Now, that authorship may be misled, it may be brilliant, or it may simply be the collision of these two massive armed constructs when the rounds are finally fired, and then what happens after that. He goes on to say, quote, limitations in regard to strategy are perhaps best evident in the Afghanistan war, which demonstrates how strategies narrowly focused on deployment of force are bound to face difficulties. With national defense establishments focusing on deterrence and maintenance of the status quo during the relatively stable years of the Cold War, most countries lacked experience on how to change it through warfare. The Russian occupation of Crimea came at the precise moment the counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan failed catastrophically. Paradoxically, the concept of hybrid war, which emphasizes combining different ways and means, allowed shifting attention from the failure to do so in Afghanistan. In this way, the timing of the Russian occupation of the Crimea was opportune for Western militaries, which never had to admit defeat against the Taliban. With an urgent new threat, there was little pressure to draw lessons from the long war. End of quote. Again and again, it's almost as if it's Groundhog Day. Folks at the highest levels, because of what I refer to as strategic deficit disorder, refuse to allow themselves to consider that either they're mistaken, their strategies and stratagems aren't working, or that they need to go back to the drawing board and reconfigure the architecture of what they're trying to achieve, because in the end, it is a disaster. Now, mind you, hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare, is political warfare. But then again, there's no such thing as non-political warfare, because as the 19th century talked to us through the persona of Clausewitz on war, where he said that that war was simply an extension of political will. When you look at Huntington, for instance, he's been accused of misunderstanding Clausewitz, who, according to a different reading, rejected a politically neutral military that waged compartmentalized war in isolation from the surrounding society. The question of whether warfare can be thus compartmentalized highlights the two understandings of strategy: broad, grand strategy and narrow military strategy, and ultimately begs the question of who owns war, end of quote. Well, when it comes to hybrid and gray zone, as I mentioned, there's nothing new here. The only new instantiation here is the fact that technology has advanced and technology has been used. For instance, color revolutions back at the beginning of the 20th century were votes that were purchased, ballot boxes that were screwed with. But with today's color revolutions, computers and numbers and influence campaigns and advertisement and greasing the palms of the right political actors can lead to the outcomes that these political war practitioners are trying to draw from. Kaiko says something very important when it comes to hybrid war. Quote, while hybrid wars entered academic policy and public debates, it still frequently does so in the guise of a poorly defined neologism. In its evolved form, hybrid war is a buzzword that can mean almost anything. The situation is only slightly better with gray zone conflict. Like political warfare, both these concepts are equal to grand strategy in their breadth. While this kind of conceptual vagueness can explain in part the popularity of these concepts, in policy circles especially, ambiguity hinders a better understanding of contemporary war and warfare, and ultimately a better policy. The ambiguity appears unfortunate and above all unnecessary. He goes on, regardless of what calls this kind of war, hybrid war envisages that military means have lost their primacy in producing political ends. On one hand, relying on force has become more expensive and hence difficult. On the other hand, the aim sought in war may not be best delivered through death and destruction or the threat of it. From the strategic theory perspective, this development must be understood to emphasize grand strategy that applies all available means at the cost of narrow political strategy that focuses on mere violence. The use of similar kinds of strategy that sought to tie together various military and non-military means in Afghanistan suggest inherent challenges. What most practitioners can agree on, however, is that military means alone will not suffice when faced with fundamentally political problems. End of quote. Now, I find that really interesting, but nonetheless, what we have to keep in mind is that when it comes to linear and non-linear conflict, it always has political ramifications for what occurs afterwards. We are concerned about what occurs afterwards, but we're also concerned with what causes it in the first place. So when one looks at the chessboard of modern warfare, not only do you find the artillery, the navy, the ground forces, the tanks, the air forces, the planes, the missiles, the integrated air and missile defense, and all of those things, but all of those are interwoven at the edges with manifestations of hybrid warfare in two permutations. That first permutation would be special operations forces, influence campaigns, color revolutions, political intrigue, the kind of things that occur when two or more of the parties involved in a very large conflict, everybody in that first 24 hours thought that that conflict would be over in a week. But we know from history that's never the way it plays out. That you would also have diplomatic moves, maneuvering, those kind of things. Remember, successful diplomacy only occurs if you have sufficient kinetic arrows in your quiver to use as a veiled threat or a real threat to those you're negotiating with to make their position more favorable to your national security aims, whether those would be neutrality or the defeat or stalemate of the enemy at hand. I will include these articles in the show notes, but there is a Borislav Bankov who also wrote an interesting piece on this, and I'll quote, "Hybrid warfare would be less of a conceptual gray zone as scholars always define the phenomenon when using it. This is also true in policymaking, where unclear definitions lead to ineffective policy implementation. Thus, acknowledgement by the EU and NATO that their experts cannot define hybrid warfare easily are insufficient. Given how pervasive the concept is in policies that determine the Western defense architecture, policymakers must develop a workable definition that leads to actionable steps, especially where the invocation of legal causes is concerned. The need for a workable definition of hybrid warfare is even more pertinent considering the 2022 escalation in the Ukraine." So this fellow says that we must continue theoretical research on hybrid warfare, but I'm telling you, for the most part, hybrid warfare is nothing more than the conjoining of the kinetic with the non-kinetic. Black propaganda, white propaganda, color revolutions, ballot stuffing, political meandering, and Machiavellian intrigue, Machiavellian whispers, and all those kind of things that take place during war that aren't necessarily kinetic in nature. Now, one can say that hybrid warfare would of course include kinetic measures that are taken. In the past, I have discussed special operations forces and made the case, as does the schoolhouse, that they are strategic compression activities, which means that they use tactical means to achieve operational and strategic ends. That is simply the bread and butter of special operations forces, small elite groups of highly trained men who are sent on heroic or non-heroic missions to throw a monkey wrench, as it were, into the military works architecture of the enemy and bring the end of the war closer than farther. By the way, that article I just cited has 6.5 pages of citation. Being on the outside, looking in at the irregular warfare community, for there is a very large irregular warfare think tank universe currently in the West, a lot of it being funded by the U.S. government. But of course, it is infested by people who not only see the righteousness in color revolutions, not only see the goodness in America continuing to be a global policeman and a planetary hegemon, but also take a view of counterinsurgency that is quite the opposite of what this podcast has always taken. In other words, due to anti-fragility, bureaucratic inertia, base incompetence, a lack of strategic and grand strategic wargaming at a level that brooks dissent, discontent, and difference of opinion on what would happen, that those things in the end don't work very well at all in the real world. And then we come to the worthies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, in which they penned an article called The Future of Hybrid Warfare, July 8th, 2024. And to quote from there, quote, Chinese thinking about more unconventional approaches to conflict includes the three warfare, psychological, political, and lawfare, to achieve its goals. For example, its investment in the United Front Department serves to control the behavior and narrative of Chinese diasporas and foreign communities while using front organizations to maximize Chinese influence overseas. China is also increasing its use of commercial security operations to protect its economic and political interests abroad. The probability of indirect and proxy Chinese intervention should be anticipated as Chinese interests expand in depth and reach. Lastly, China's continued use of blurred tactics and quasi-military forces in the maritime domain, almost riffing off of the little green men that the Russians employed in Nagorno-Karabakh in the fall of 2020. China has been carefully adapting its maritime assets and extending its influence, conducting hybrid or gray zone actions with Chinese characteristics as NATO countries deploy forces to the Pacific region to defend international norms and order. They will face Chinese hybrid warfare activities there as well as in other regions, as China's reach expands to the Middle East and possibly the Arctic, end of quote. And also, as I have mentioned in previous podcasts, but I think it is germane to this discussion, when it comes to Africa, America has lost its grip. When it comes to soft power and some military power, China absolutely dominates Africa. When it comes to military power and hard power, Russia absolutely dominates Africa. This is the first of several dominoes that the United States global hegemon is losing its bets on and losing its grips on. This is a direct result of hybrid warfare. As a matter of fact, quote, in response, NATO has adopted an expansive definition of hybrid conflict that includes political interference, sabotage, subversion, and malign influence activities. That perspective captures the alliance's persistent challenge from Moscow, which has long favored indirect methods of active measures and now includes mass media disinformation. In response, NATO places resiliency as the first line of deterrence and defense. End of quote. Well, they're not doing very well at all. When it comes to active measures, what he's referring to here is hearkening back to the old Soviet days of desinformacja maskarovka, which is disinformation and masking, mimicking, and even reversing perceptions in the West through compounding media narratives that are going in the wrong direction, such as the Russiagate nonsense and the COVIDiocy that occurred in the last 10 years, are examples of where these propaganda efforts can go very much the wrong way. The conclusion to this particular article is the future is likely to see the most consequential form of armed conflict in the lower to middle portion of the conflict spectrum, likely with surrogates and proxies. End of quote. Remember, surrogates and proxies was the way the Cold War was fought. Fortunately, quote, NATO has invested time and thought into this problem and has slowly integrated countering surrogates and proxies into its strategies for collective defense and integrated deterrence. End of quote. That's a bunch of poppycock and nonsense. It is the typical triumphalist nonsense that emanates from U.S. and Western think tanks. Again, hybrid warfare is here. Gray zone warfare is here. What it does is it takes means that are not militarily kinetic and connects them to the war aims of the antagonist or foe. So recently, the Congressional Research Service, and I'm the guy who reads this stuff so that you don't have to, I find this to be some of the most reliable, whether it is an Inspector General report or an analytical paper that's provided, in which the Congress has actually done its due diligence and has studied something and come to conclusions that are very useful. In this case, August 11th, 2026, the CRS published Russian Hybrid Warfare Activities in Europe, Considerations for Congress. There are a couple of case studies in there. One of them involves Poland. Analysts have observed that Russia frequently targets Poland with a range of hybrid warfare tactics, including the following: cyber attacks and influence campaigns. Polish officials reportedly accuse Russia of attempting to interfere in Poland's 2025 presidential election by spreading disinformation on the internet and conducting cyber attacks against critical infrastructure. Press reports indicate that in May 2025's speech prior to his election, Polish Deputy Prime Minister and Digital Affairs Minister Krzysztof Gałkowski stated, quote, "We are currently witnessing unprecedented Russian interference in the electoral process," end of quote. There's also espionage and sabotage. In April 2025, Poland's Internal Security Agency reported that since Russia's 2022 invasion of the Ukraine, the agency has detained 44 people in relation to spying or sabotage on behalf of Russia or Belarus. Those apprehended included Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Poles accused or convicted of engaging in a range of hybrid warfare activity, including an arson attack against a Warsaw shopping center, surveillance of sensitive military locations, and plans to attack railways carrying supplies for the Ukraine. On November 16, 2025, two separate attacks damaged Polish rail lines in what Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk called an unprecedented act of sabotage. And there was an interesting note here where they weaponized migration. Some analysts and European officials assert that Russia and its ally Belarus have sought to use migration to destabilize the EU. End of quote. I think that's an excuse and a gross rationalization of the very poor, well, one may say porous immigration policies of the entirety of the EU-USSR and the UK. So let's examine this from an historical perspective. I had mentioned Leto Vorbeck, I had mentioned Collins, I had mentioned Lawrence in passing early on in this episode. Well, what about Churchill's deliberate starvation during World War II of the Bengal famine, what about the fact that, for the most part, Churchill was not only allied with Stalin, but bent over backwards, as did FDR, to make the world safe for communism? And this was outside of the kinetic framework of defeating the Japanese, the Italians, and the Germans. The Italians, of course, by 1945, having dropped out materially from the war and not even seeking neutrality, joined the Allies and left the Axis. So I'm going to suspend my disbelief and think that, well, maybe this isn't yet another scholarly mirage that's created by the Department of War and Defense intellectual community to find yet another way to drain American and Western taxpayers of a lot of money given to grants to investigate a phenomenon that, by the way, happens to be from the University of the Intuitively Obvious, happens to be one that has been practiced from time immemorial, and also happens to be, as I have covered in a past episode on color revolutions, something that the U.S. and the West have been doing for the longest time. I'd mentioned the Israelis, but if you were to look at all warring nations, for the most part, aside from the kinetic mass and professional armies, air forces, navies, and other such manifestations, there is always a political flavor at the outside, on the seams of that conflict, that is trying to either gain momentum, gain favor, or even influence the way not only the kinetic war is happening, but the industrial base of the enemy, the consent of the enemy's people to continue the war, the use of influence operations within the enemy's camp by those who are fighting that threat to influence them in other ways. So I'm not trying to diminish what hybrid warfare is doing. What I'm trying to do is establish a definitional construct that makes this useful in prosecuting wars, or even more useful in my mind, to preventing the wars from occurring in the first place. America, since the early 1980s, but I would suggest it goes back to the ending of World War II, has participated in color revolutions, which are nefarious political activities, vote tampering apparatuses, and political monkey wrenching, and even intentional gerrymandering of threat countries to have political outcomes that the U.S. and or its Western allies consider neutral or beneficial to their perceived national security stance in the region. America is no white knight in this particularity. A lot of this started in the 1980s with the Philippines campaign, but then again, I could go back to 1898 to 1902 with the Spanish-American War, and one can look, as I reflected on in my episode when it came to Memorial Day and Veterans Day, the absolutely heinous and hideous things that American arms did in the island archipelagos of the Philippines. Were they kinetic? They were. They led to the death or maiming of people all around the area, but it didn't necessarily find itself helping the war effort so much as hampering it. So I'm not dismissing hybrid warfare. As a matter of fact, I would suggest to you that hybrid warfare, the commingling or even the coupling of non-kinetic activities and quasi-military activities, there is no political actor, and of course all wars are political acts, who has clean hands when it comes to this kind of thing. Now, in the next episode, what I'd really like to do is examine in depth a particular hybrid warfare instantiation. I'm going to do two of those. I'm going to do one that is historical and one that is contemporary, and then I hope to compare and contrast the two of those. And what we're going to try to suss out, what we're going to try to discern in these is, what are the kinetic activities? What are the non-kinetic activities? Were any of those germinated from the military brain trust to begin with? Were they socio-political military combines that sought to use every means possible to prevail in the war, or to achieve that stalemate, or to achieve that kind of frozen conflict? We're going to examine that in depth in the next 2 episodes. Again, one will be historical, one will be contemporary, most likely, but I can't guarantee this. That contemporary example may very well be the Ukraine-Russian war, but we'll see, because it happens to be, well, as a matter of fact, since so many conflicts in the last 10 years, one in which I don't know where the truth is. At times, as a military historian, I can take my appreciation of terrain, whether that's physical or intellectual, and see if the syllogisms, the arguments, the premises, all of these lead to the conclusions that we've been almost, I would say, bred to believe in the West, because of the way the West, and especially the United States, perceives the war, always perceiving that we are the good guys and that nothing like internment camps, rendition facilities, torture, lawfare, color revolutions, vote tampering, political tampering, any of these non-kinetic manifestations of modern warfare. But I would suggest to you that this has been in attendance to warfare since the first man took the bone from a large animal and knocked the head of a guy he assumed was somebody he should fight at the time, either at his own behest on a revenge tour or part of a tribe against tribe altercation that led to injury, bloodshed, maiming, and killing. I was actually very hesitant to take this on because it really seems like an arcane, if not almost academic, exercise to determine how many angels dance on the head of a pin. But I find that when it comes to the defense intelligentsia in the West, they fancy themselves when they find these buzzwords like hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare, and all of the different instantiations and permutations of this, and it takes on a life of its own that, in my mind, for the most part, delays the conclusion of a war. In that CSR document, there was an interesting note in there to quote, in the United States, according to defense analyst Frank Hoffman, the first public use of the term hybrid warfare by a military official was at Forum 2005, where General James Mattis presented a concept of hybrid warfare as a merger of different forms of warfare, including conventional, irregular, terrorist, and criminal. Subsequent publications by General Mattis and Hoffman, particularly in Hoffman's 2007 report, Conflict in the 21st Century, The Rise of Hybrid Wars, further explored the topic. Now note, it reads conventional, irregular, terrorist, and criminal. I'm here to tell you that during World War II, as a frozen spot in time, when it was Churchill who said that I seek to set Europe ablaze, he was doing that in a sense in which, yes, conventional, yes, irregular, yes, terrorist, because of course, even non-combatants were assassinated, such as political officials in Vichy France under Nazi domination by Allied soldiers, spies, espionage agents, assassins, and those who were sent in there to dispose of folks. For instance, there was Operation Anthropoid, which was a World War II codename for the successful Allied mission to assassinate SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich. It was carried out in Prague on May 27, 1942 by Czechoslovak resistance soldiers Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis. It was the only government-sponsored assassination of a senior Nazi leader during the war. By the way, it's characterized as he was a Nazi leader, even though he was in uniform, as something of a Roman-style proconsul in Czechoslovakia proper, but nonetheless, it was an objective of taking out a political leader. I have often said that one manifestation of hybrid warfare, and I do think that it's going to have probably implications that we'll all find very interesting, in which what would happen if all political leaders involved in a war initiated at any time, and I mean political leaders across the board, in which all those political leaders assumed combatant status and were, if properly targeted and eliminated and assassinated, all is good and fair in love and war. In other words, what incentives would that give to acting political agents if they knew that their lives were just as much in the hazard as the soldiers that sallied forth to take on the political opponents, or in that case, the military armies, air forces, and navies, possibly even Marines, of the other forces? Would that cause incentives to change for politicians going to war? I do think that that is a manifestation, if somewhat untried, of hybrid warfare and gray zone conflict. So look, this has probably been, regretfully, one of the more drier and absurdly academic treatments of an irregular warfare pillar or component, but I thought that this was the necessary preamble or prelude to me providing an historical and then a contemporary example of what this hybrid warfare looks like in the 21st century. Because one thing that we want to learn from all of these things, and I'm willing to learn them, especially if I'm showing the evidence that I happen to be wrong, is that in this 21st century, in this second quarter of the 21st century, war has changed fundamentally. There are revolutions in military affairs that are going on as we speak, whether it's the UAV and FPV that in 5 years has rendered moot the efficacy of the single combat soldier on the battlefield, and that, in essence, we don't need camouflage anymore. You can have soldiers out there in bright orange suits for all the good it will do them from the multispectral detection that is available with UAVs, FPVs, new sensor suites, sensor systems, and those kind of things. We are not on the cusp, but we have passed that cusp of completely different RMAs in this era. And I regret to inform you, I think that the almost $1 trillion Department of War and all of its ancillary apologists in the defense intellectual circles, they aren't keeping up with the news. They're not paying attention in the way and fashion that they should. And we will pay a heavy price for that. So, join me again in a fortnight for yet another episode in this particular examination of hybrid warfare. This is Bill. And if you enjoyed this, be sure to give me a 4 or 5-star review. I am forever in your debt if you give me a narrative review. If you wish to get in touch with me, you can get in touch with me at cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me. Please get on my Substack if you get the opportunity. One of the reasons why I created my Substack page was so that this, being the 86th episode of Chasing Ghosts, there's a commentariat function there, and I would love to hear from you, especially gentlemanly disagreement with things that I say. So with that, thanks for listening. Thanks for taking the time. Please share with family, friends, and colleagues if you think they would enjoy what I've been doing. This is Bill, out.